Welcome to this video lecture. In this lecture, we are going to study about entity relationship model and its component. Here we begins with definition of ER model. Different components will start with entity, different types of entity, then attribute, different types of attribute, and at the end relationship. This is the definition of ER model. ER model basically stands for Entity Relationship Model. It is a high level model and is used to establish the relationship between different entities. A database structure having different levels like physical level, conceptual level, view level. So this ER model is basically developed in the conceptual level of a database structure. In ER modeling, the database structure is portrayed as a diagram, and that diagram is called as entity relationship diagram. This is the definition of ER model. Now we'll see an example. Here you can see that suppose we are going to design or develop a database for a school, and the school have a student entity with the attribute name, address, ID and age. So for that particular example, the ER model looks like this. For one entity, student, ER model looks like this. This is the example, basic or very simple example of ER model. Now, different components of ER diagram. The ER model or a ER diagram have three basic components like entity, attribute and a relationship. They may be classified as entity, may be classified as weak entity or strong entity, attribute may be key attribute or composite attribute or multi-valued attribute, or it may be derived attribute. Relationship may be one-to-one relationship, one-to-many relationship, many-to-one relationship, or many-to-many relationship. So we'll see one by one each attribute in detail. Start with entity. Entity is any real world object like table, chair, fan, mobile, monitor, keyboard, anything that is present or that is available in a real world is called an entity. And we represent entity by a rectangle symbol in the case of ER diagram. Here you can see that employee is an entity, department is an entity, and employee works for department. This diamond symbol shows the relationship between these two entities. Employee works for particular department. So this is about entity. Now we have weak entity. So as I told you, entity may be weak entity or a strong entity. An entity may be a strong entity if there exists a primary key that uniquely identify all the attribute of that particular entity is called as strong entity. But if an entity depends on another entity, then it is called as weak entity, and we represent weak entity by double rectangle symbol in the case of ER diagram. Here you can see that installment directly depends on what? Loan. Installment entity depends on loan entity. So this installment we represent by double rectangle symbol here. The next component is attribute. Attribute are the properties of an entity and we represent by ellipse symbol. So here you can see that student is an entity and name, address, ID and age, different attributes, different properties of particular entity student. So we represent attributes like this in ER diagram for a particular entity. Next, we'll start the category of attributes. Attribute may be a key attribute. Key attribute means, suppose this is the example where you can see that student is an entity and ID, phone number, name, age, four different attributes. Here you see carefully, I have underlined the ID attributes. That means ID is my key attribute. Every student have a unique ID. Every student have a unique ID, and that ID uniquely identify the particular student. So this is the key attribute basically. Here is, I can mark ID as a key attribute in the case of student. If I talk about faculty as an entity, then faculty ID may be the key attribute. Employee here, then if employee is an entity, then employee ID is a key attribute in that particular case. So key attribute is an attribute that provide a unique identification to all other attributes of that particular entity. Next is composite attribute. Composite attribute is the attribute that composed of many other attributes. Here you can see that name is composed of first name, last name or middle name. So an attribute that composed of many other attributes is called as composite attribute. Next we have is multi-valued attribute. An attribute that have multiple values is called as multi-valued attribute. It is possible for an entity that have an attribute that have multiple values. That attribute is called as multi-valued attribute, and we represent that multi-valued attribute by double oval symbol. Here you can see that phone number is an example of multi-valued attribute. If I talk about faculty as an entity, so every faculty have one or more phone numbers, right? So phone number is a multi-valued attribute. Next we have is derived attribute, an attribute that derived from another attribute is called as derived attribute, and we represent derived attribute by dashed symbol, dashed ellipse or dashed oval we represent it. So here you can see that in this example student is an entity, name, date of birth, roll number, age are the attribute, but look carefully. Here I'll mark age attribute in a dashed line. Why? Because this is a derived attribute. I can derive an age of a student by its date of birth. If I know the date of birth of particular student, then I can easily get his age or his or her age. Then we can call it age as a derived attribute by the date of birth attribute. So derived attribute is an attribute that can derive by other attribute for that particular entity, and we represent derived attribute by dashed ellipse. Now, the last component of an ER model is relationship. Relationship is an important component of an ER model, is used to establish the relationship between different entities. Here you can see that student is an entity, teacher is an entity, and there may always exist a relationship between teacher and student. So teacher teaches student. So we represent this relation by using the diamond symbol or rhombus symbol. So in the case of ER diagram, we represent relationship between different entities or one or more entities by diamond symbol. Okay. Now we'll see one by one types of relationship. One-to-one relationship. When only one instance of an entity is associated with the relation, then it is called as one-to-one relationship. Like you can see in this example, female relation is married to male. So one female is going to married with one male. So here is a one-to-one relationship between female and male. The next is one-to-many relationship. Only one instance of an entity at the leftmost side and more instance of an entity at the right hand side. Then it is called as one-to-many relationship. Like you can see it as the here scientist invents invention. Scientists do invention. So scientists can invent many invention. One single scientist can do many invention. So this is the one to many in relationship. One scientist may invent or invent many invention or can do many invention. So one scientist may go for many invention, that it is called as one to many relationship. Next we are having is many to one relationship. When more than one instance of an entity at the left or only one instance of an entity at the right is associated in the relationship, then it is called as many to one relationship. Student enroll for only one course. Student enroll for only one course, but a course may have many students. So this is the example of many to one relationship. And at the end, we are having the last relationship, that is many to many relationship. When more than one instance of an entity on the left is associated with more than one instance of an entity at the right in the relationship, then it is called as many to many relationship. Here you can see that number of employees are working on a project, and number of project is distributed amongst number of employees. So employee can assign by many projects, and many projects can have many employees. So this is many to many relationship. Both the side many is the relationship. So this is about this lecture, ER model and its components. Thank you so much.